For decades, left-wing discourse has been directed from the shadows by a collection of organizations that have no official ties to any land, any state, or any government. They dominate nearly every part of the political conversation. They control so-called progressive talking points, and they have funded every single leftist politician and movement since 1960. These associations have billions of dollars in collective funding, funneling money into activists and advocacy groups that further state agendas. But these organizations haven't spent a dime on secrecy. Their actions, their institutions, and their finances are all public. But what are these groups? We call them non-governmental organizations. It all started at the tail end of the 19th century, going into the beginning of the 20th century, with the height of the Industrial Revolution and the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties gave rise to the richest financial and political dynasties in America. In 1889, growing internationalist sentiments among prominent European and American liberals spawned several international organizations, chief among them the Inter-Parliamentary Union, or IPU. The IPU's main function was to serve as a platform between parliamentary democracies, specifically for their individual members, to facilitate talks, and to prevent war. In effect, what the Union was able to do was skip over the necessary channels of government and create a pseudo-government between nations. This was primarily to facilitate talks between the French and British parliaments, as the two co-founders were originally from both of those nations. Without the pressure of non-governmental organizations like the IPU, the task may have well been impossible. Their philosophy was that of international liberalism. In the field of international relations, liberalism refers to the belief that the solidification and expansion of trade relations, specifically through the policy of free trade, is what binds countries together and prevents war. Organizations like the IPU would influence hundreds of politicians and powerful figures across both America and Europe. Andrew Carnegie was one of these men. Carnegie was not the first in history to establish philanthropy organizations, but his work in founding the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace would set the stage for the creation of hundreds, perhaps thousands of organizations later in the future. Carnegie's initial goal with his own NGO was to directly influence and direct Western policy towards defeating Germany in World War I. Until 1950, the endowment sponsored the creation and maintenance of numerous international cooperation programs across the globe. During World War II, they were instrumental in popularizing the word genocide to describe the atrocities committed by the Nazis. In December of 1945, the last man personally appointed as chairman of the board of trustees of the organization by Carnegie himself, Nicholas Murray Butler, stepped down, and John Foster Dulles took control of the endowment in his place. Not only was Dulles one of the masterminds behind the Dawes Plan, which was the scheme that placed Germany into an infinite debt cycle, but he himself was a blatant sympathizer of Adolf Hitler, forcing all of his office staff located in Berlin to sign Heil Hitler at the end of all correspondences. Dulles, like many others of his time, was a virulent anti-communist. Dulles was one of the first advocates for the idea that containment should not be a policy of strictly military confrontation, but rather a war for the hearts and minds of those who we called captives living under communism.
1,000-watt Radio Free Europe transmitter in Western Germany. This station daily pierces the Iron Curtain with the truth, answering the lies of the Kremlin and bringing a message of hope to millions trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Grateful letters from listeners smuggled past the secret police express thanks to radio.
The primary objective of the majority of NGOs, therefore, was to facilitate the CIA's globe-spanning objective of subverting and ultimately destroying communism.
At the beginning of the Cold War, communism and communist leaders all throughout the US were persecuted, their leaders put on trial, their parties infiltrated by federal agencies, and their influence rooted out. Only a few decades later, you now have leaders in Congress calling themselves socialists, celebrities coming out in favour of wealth redistribution, and backlash against the US on social media platforms by people that want to end the imperialist US state. Across the West, there is a resurgence of people calling for socialist policies, and a sudden uptick in growth for so-called communist and socialist organisations in the United States. How did things change so radically? In order to answer this question, we must talk about the history of communist movements in the United States, the creation of the so-called alphabet organisations, and the political economy of the West at large. World War II was more than just a struggle of tanks, ships, and planes. There was another, secretive dimension to the conflict that in recent years has taken on a legendary reputation. While in previous wars, nations have always been known for the usage of spies, the Second World War's outcome was particularly affected by their contribution. More broadly, however, and as a direct consequence of the lessons learned from the First World War, the total integration of espionage agencies, non-governmental organisations, and the all-tying bind of international finance were not only essential in ending the war, but perhaps even starting it in the first place. At the outbreak of war, the United States was poorly equipped to deal with the challenges presented by their enemies in Germany and Japan, particularly in the field of espionage. In fact, for decades beforehand, the Nazis had been utilising several German-American diaspora organisations to further their own political goals within both Germany and the United States. This led President Roosevelt to authorise the creation of the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. It was the direct predecessor to the CIA. However, it was not Roosevelt who ran and controlled the organisation. That responsibility was held by Charles Dick Ellis, who worked closely with US Army officer William J. Donovan, though Ellis was the real mastermind behind the operation. Charles Ellis was not only an agent of MI6, the infamous intelligence bureau of His Majesty's government, he was also accused several times in his lifetime for being a double agent of Nazi Germany during the pre-war era. His foreign connections seemed to pose no offence to the US government, however, as he was given near complete free rein over how to run the OSS. Thanks to his efforts, which are falsely attributed to William J. Donovan, the OSS would grow and expand its capabilities during the war, providing services crucial to the war effort. After the war, President Truman officially dissolved the OSS. Its subsidiary functions and groups were consolidated under various separate military branches until Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, creating what would eventually become the CIA. The role of the CIA was primarily to stave off the threat of communism by any means necessary. During the Cold War, they created and supported multiple movements and organizations across the world to fight against the Soviet Union. One of the most famous of these efforts was the creation of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. On the CIA's official website, they say that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was one of their most daring and effective Cold War covert operations, despite officially denying any involvement in it for decades. Artists, intellectuals, and thinkers across the entire West were driven away from communism by this single CIA operation that had gathered the entirety of Europe and America's leading leftist figures to denounce what they called Stalin's empire. And, nearly overnight, managed to completely overturn the popular opinion at the time that communism was more congenial to culture than liberalism. This conference was so influential on the world that the CIA itself was changed by its rapid and incredible success. Ever since the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA has solidified its strategy of countering communism by backing non-communist leftists and socialists. By utilizing contacts held by several government operatives to leading socialist and anti-communist figures, they had effectively herded the vast majority of the entire West's left to follow their lead. The man in charge was Sidney Hook, who was quoted in 1949 with saying, "Give me $100 million and 1,000 dedicated people, and I will guarantee to generate such a wave of democratic unrest among the masses, yes, even among the soldiers of Stalin's own empire, that all his problems for a long period of time to come will be internal. I can find the people." Hook's program especially targeted people like Jay Lovestone, a former member of the Communist Party of the United States who was kicked from the party in 1929 for his right-wing opportunism and belief that socialist practice should take a more moderate tone than other countries in the world, due to his contention of American exceptionalism, the belief that the state of development in America foreclosed the possibility of socialist revolution akin to that in the Soviet Union. After being expelled from the CPUSA, Lovestone would go on to join the American Federation of Labor and work closely with Irving Brown, another associate of the Office of Strategic Services who had worked in labor unions for decades. Together, they organized labor unions in the Americas and Europe specifically to fight against communist-controlled labor unions. They both reported their activities to CIA agent James Jesus Angleton, who utilized the information they gathered on labor movements to be weaponized against the Soviet Union. Like many American efforts abroad in the 40s and 50s, these union activities were to be funded by the Marshall Plan, the American finance project to reconstruct Europe. Among these people Sidney Hook recruited to join the Congress in 1950 were leftist neutralists, who ostensibly opposed America but hated Stalin, as well as anarchists, Trotskyites, former OSS officers, and Freemasons. This included people like Franz Borkenau, an anti-authoritarian Marxist thinker, John Dewey, an infamous defender of Trotsky, Ignacio Siloni, a US-sponsored anti-communist author, James Burnham, a Trotskyist with ties to the OSS, Hugh Trevor Roper, a member of the Freemasons, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., an OSS officer, Bertrand Russell, who sympathized with Trotskyism, Raymond Aron, another anti-authoritarian Marxist thinker, Benedetto Croce, Max Chapman, an associate of Trotsky, and many others. The Congress would also be funded through the Marshall Plan. Together, they would, in essence, establish what we know today as the modern left, a hodgepodge movement of social progressivism, anti-Stalinism, and ultimately, anti-communism as a whole. Like many of his other Trotskyite colleagues, Max Chapman attempted making leftist political organizations in the aftermath of Leon Trotsky's exile from the Soviet Union, and worked with James Burnham to create the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States. James Burnham was also an important organizer of the Congress and held close ties to the OSS and their successor, the CIA. During his time working for the OSS in World War II, Burnham managed to get a firm grasp on how to effectively disseminate propaganda to the masses and the basic principles of information warfare. Burnham, like Chapman, regarded the Soviet Union not as a degenerated workers' state, but rather an imperialist country that was indistinguishable from other countries in essence. By 1940, however, Burnham dropped the pretension of communism and rejected Marxism-Leninism in its entirety. In a letter to the National Committee of the Workers' Party, Burnham addressed the committee by announcing his resignation, stating, "I reject, as you know, the philosophy of Marxism, dialectical materialism. The general Marxian theory of universal history, to the extent that it has any empirical content, seems to me disproved by modern historical and anthropological investigation. Marxian economics seems to me, for the most part, either false or obsolete or meaningless in application to contemporary economic phenomena. Those aspects of Marxian economics which retain validity do not seem to me to justify the theoretical structure of the economics. Not only do I believe it meaningless to say that socialism is inevitable, and false that socialism is the only alternative to capitalism, I consider that, on the basis of the evidence now available to us, a new form of exploitive society, which I call managerial society, is not only possible, but is a more probable outcome of the present than socialism." After his resignation, Burnham would go on to write for the National Review and would eventually lay down the foundations for neoconservatism. His impact on American and Western politics was so immense that he was even awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Reagan. By the time he joined the National Review, he was no longer the critic of systems he had spent years attacking. Neoconservatism, with its blend of economic liberalism and a hawkish foreign policy, can trace much of its intellectual DNA back to Burnham's work. In 1967, the Congress would be renamed to the International Association for Cultural Freedom, and would go on to be funded almost entirely by the Ford Foundation. Members of the Marshall Plan's organizations would move on to new projects. This new project would be known as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, a direct successor of the OEEC. The OECD would become a worldwide organization that would direct, manage, and control the funds being sent to Europe as part of America's plan to rebuild Western Europe as a bulwark against the Soviet Union.
Why is it that nearly all governments in the world, particularly Western governments, have such an obsession with climate change? Can it simply be because activist organizations have abnormally powerful messaging? It seems unlikely that a government would pursue a purely moral policy out of ethical concern, when more important issues such as defense and economic stability are the preeminent questions for sovereign states. Many say that governments now recognize the existential threat of climate change, but does this entirely explain their hardened resolve to at least nominally fight against it? To solve this question, we must first begin with the OECD. After the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the ideological foundations of the West had been completely renovated, and even the framing of the West's view of history itself had been changed forever. But this would not have happened without the Marshall Plan and the OEEC, later called the OECD. Part of the OECD's plan to control global economic activity would eventually lead to their backing of environmentalism. Environmentalism's modern form can be traced back to what is known as the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome was founded by two men, an Italian industrialist and philanthropist by the name of Aurelio Peccei, and the Director General for Scientific Affairs at the OECD, Alexander King. The two men gathered a small group of international bureaucrats in Rome and talked about how the world's problems could not be solved through developmental technological means. Together, the group wrote a paper called The Predicament of Mankind, a sort of quasi-manifesto that outlined the group's intentions and ideology. Importantly, their ideas centered around the belief that the concept of infinite growth was impossible due to resource scarcity and increasingly severe levels of pollution. In 1972, the club released a report called The Limits to Growth, a report that alleged that sometime in the near future, a total population and industrial collapse was inevitable if resource extraction and industrialization continued at its current pace. In effect, the Club of Rome had laid down the basis of modern environmentalism, centered on an undeniably Malthusian ideology of degrowth, honing in on the issues created by an alleged overpopulation problem. In effect, the Club of Rome was the first organization to broadly awaken the world to the issues of environmentalism, all off of the OECD's dollar. Central to the Club of Rome's belief system was the concept of problématique, or problematic. Nowadays, the word is extremely common, but many people have forgotten that it originally came from a group of degrowth environmentalists. Its usage actually began around the same time as the club's formation in the late 60s, and is now used today by academics across the Western world. The club would wield this term to broadly define what they defined as systemic problems, and would be one of the group's most important academic terms. In the Club of Rome's paper, The Predicament of Mankind, it is written that, when we consider the truly critical issues of our time, such as environmental deterioration, poverty, endemic ill health, urban blight, criminality, etc., we find it virtually impossible to view them as problems that exist in isolation, or as problems capable of being solved in their own terms. For even the most cursory examination will at least reveal the more obvious, though not necessarily the most important, links between problems. Some more astute viewers may note that this sounds familiar to intersectionality, the belief that any form of oppression cannot be reduced down to a core element, and that rather, it is a multitude of identities and forms that interlink with one another. The Club of Rome worked closely with their parent organization, the OECD, to develop policy in tandem with them and to acquire legitimacy for their organization. Through various interpersonal relationships developed by Alexander King, who was still in charge of the OECD at the time, the Club of Rome met with multiple industrialists and influential thought leaders. King and other club members held connections with the highest halls of power, and their speeches and writings went all the way up to the top. Nixon's own speechwriter had heard a presentation at the February 1969 OECD ministerial meeting and had proposed that Nixon use the phrase "problems of modern society," a Club of Rome term, in Nixon's new initiative to rebrand NATO. Later, the Nixon administration pressed for the creation of a committee on the challenges for modern societies within NATO. The aim was to use environmental problems to further East-West dialogue, to broaden the concept of security to include environmental security, and to improve NATO's image, especially with young people, by demonstrating its concern to influence for good the nature of the society it is designed to protect. Though only part of NATO's attempts to rebrand itself as a socially conscious organization, environmentalism was a cornerstone of the West's strategy to culturally dominate and overwhelm the Eastern Bloc. Armed with the Club of Rome's degrowth ideology, several organizations were founded to carry out its message with fiery resolve, targeting the rapidly industrializing European powers. One of these organizations was called the World Wildlife Fund, also known as the WWF. The WWF was founded by multiple people, including Sir Julian Huxley, a British eugenicist and internationalist. Huxley was fascinated with zoology and was a bright and studious boy in his youth. During World War I, Huxley was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the British Army Intelligence Corps. After World War II, he became involved in the creation of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, and became its first Director General in 1946. During his short term in office, he wrote a 60-page booklet called UNESCO, Its Purpose and Its Philosophy, where he described UNESCO's mission as being one of fresh impulse to popular education and to the spread of culture, the ideal of equality, of educational opportunity without regard to race, sex, or any distinctions, economic or social, educational methods best suited to prepare the children of the world for the responsibilities of freedom. He also prescribed population control programs as part of UNESCO's mission, stating that the recognition of the idea of an optimum population size, of course relative to the technological and social conditions, is an indispensable first step towards that planned control of populations which is necessary if man's blind reproductive urges are not to wreck his ideals and his plans for material and spiritual betterment, suggesting that the nations of the world should advocate for the use of birth control as a means of controlling overpopulation. Julian Huxley always had an interest in the Soviet Union. During the interwar era, between the First and Second World Wars, he visited the USSR and was inspired by their methods of economic planning, becoming the founding member of the political and economic planning think tank upon his return to England. However, in 1949, his attitude towards them changed drastically after the adoption of Lysenkoism by Joseph Stalin. Furiously writing articles attacking Stalin's policies, he soon became an outspoken critic of communism, when previously he was more or less tolerant of Stalin's work. It wasn't until he left UNESCO that he founded the World Wildlife Fund in 1961 with the extremely wealthy British nobleman Sir Peter Scott and 3 other well-known ornithologists. Originally, the WWF was meant to be a fundraising organization for the IUCN, but eventually the organization grew so large that by 1985 it had severed the majority of their ties and set up their own projects. The majority of its funding came from 3 sources: Prince Bernhard of Dutch royalty, Prince Philip of British royalty, and Godfrey A. Rockefeller, the grandson of John D. Rockefeller's brother. In fact, the organization's first president was Prince Bernhard, and without the funding and resources provided by the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, it is unknown how much the organization would have grown. The WWF's mission soon changed to one of controlling industrialization efforts within the Global South. During the 1960s, the WWF sponsored several conservation efforts in Africa to curtail the expansion of agricultural land and to reduce illegal hunting of animals. On the Kenya-Tanzania border, large-scale wheat farming enterprises had been set up in Africa to reduce Kenya's reliance on Western food imports and begin the long process of achieving economic sovereignty. While the International Monetary Fund had ostensibly been supporting these developments, in reality, their focus was on increasing cash crop production, such as coffee and tea, for export to European countries. In fact, the ideology of environmentalism had not changed significantly to this day. Organizations like the WWF, such as the Environmental Defense Fund, have similar origins wrapped in finance capital. Inspired by government worker Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a book discussing the harmful effects of pesticides on the environment, the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, has skyrocketed to the highest halls of power, directly lobbying Congress members and state legislatures to pass desired policies. Their biggest donors rank among the wealthiest families of America, including the Walton family, the founders of Walmart, and the MacArthur Foundation. These interests are not skin deep either. During 2011 and 2012, the Walton family supplied about 1/8 of the organization's roughly $100 million annual budget. Sam Walton, Walmart's founder, is a member of the EDF's Board of Trustees. In 2010, they gave an even larger sum of $71 million. The hypocrisy of the world's richest families and financial trusts funding projects in environmentalism is yet to be matched by groups like the Climate Emergency Fund, the brainchild of anti-nuclear emergency activist and member of the Kennedy family, Rory Kennedy, along with her colleague Aileen Getty, the granddaughter of petroleum industrialist J. Paul Getty, who founded the Getty Oil Company.
Our governments have proven they will not act to save us unless we push them. That's oil, folks. The Climate Emergency Fund. Everything depends on what we do right now. That's oil, folks. That's oil, folks. That's oil, folks.
The Climate Emergency Fund has given money to various protest groups, which are noted for going beyond simple peaceful protests many times throughout its existence. Most notably, they were the group behind the incident at London's National Gallery in October 2022, when the two members threw soup on the glass display of Vincent van Gogh's 1888 painting, Sunflowers, while also gluing themselves to the wall adjacent to the painting. What exactly interests the richest of the world in such philanthropist projects? One could imagine that they simply believe in them, and to some extent that might certainly be true. The Walton family, along with the MacArthur Foundation, heavily invests in these projects, donating millions of dollars every year to a variety of NGOs that heavily promote the idea of environmental preservation, which has influenced almost every sector of public life. On the surface, it makes no sense as to why an oil company would create environmental projects. However, there is an underlying logic behind such moves. One example happened in Peru in 2023 with Shell, wherein, to comply with carbon neutrality goals, Shell purchased $500 million worth of rainforest land, allowing them to technically claim they were carbon neutral, but in reality were still producing the same amount of carbon dioxide as before. Local communities were forced into selling this land to Shell, displacing them and driving them off land that they had lived on for generations. This modern-day enclosement of the commons continues around the world in search of land, not just for the public image of corporations, but also as a strong and safe financial asset, which will continue to keep its value as long as environmentalist movements continue to promote untouched land as something valuable. In some ways, this purchasing of land without developing it into something that could produce real value is worse than if the oil company had simply used the property to produce more oil. The IMF also plays a role in this, harkening back to the Club of Rome's original degrowth thesis, pushing for the de-development of countries around the globe. In 2023, Ecuador signed a deal with the International Monetary Fund to remove their fuel subsidies, which provided millions of dollars worth of fuel to citizens and businesses that would normally be unable to afford it. This was also in tandem with an overall reduction in public spending and a new focus on increasing mining and oil exports, all under the guise of green reforms. This deal with the IMF bound Ecuador's economy more tightly to foreign capital, as its citizens were essentially robbed of their financial freedoms and forced to export more capital abroad, again under the mandate of environmentalism. Another instance of this happened in Belize in 2021, wherein a portion of its $500 billion debt to foreign investors, like BlackRock, was forgiven in exchange for an expansion of marine conservation areas, which collapsed its domestic fishing economy, as well as handing of a large part of the government budget to the US-based Nature Conservancy. In Belize, like in other countries, this led to foreign companies snatching up land that could otherwise be used for productive means and selling them to NGOs and corporations, allowing for rampant speculation on their value. An incalculable amount of money has been and continues to be generated by this process of essentially stripping global south economies of their value. The project of so-called environmentalism, as we will see, does not restrict itself to the global south. The logic of environmentalism would be converted into a movement that would attack the heartland over the NGOs. This movement would be spearheaded by the NDN Collective.
What is the NDN Collective? Founded by millionaire Nicholas Stilson in 2018, the NDN Collective has transformed from a small environmentally focused Native American advocacy group into the largest and richest land-back movement in the United States. Stilson himself has had a long career in philanthropy and environmentalism, dating back to the early 2000s. He spent around 10 years working for a variety of NGOs and nonprofits, including the Bush Foundation. One of the major backers of the NDN is the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, founded by the daughter of the inventor of the modern cigarette, James Buchanan Duke. Doris Duke was described in her youth as the richest woman alive. After her death, she gave her monstrous $1.2 billion inheritance to the foundation to promote the arts, education, child welfare, and of course, environmentalism. In the very first year of its founding, the NDN Collective received over $2 million in the form of organizational grants and small donations. By the following year, this sum had ballooned fivefold to over $11 million. Nicholas pocketed a large portion of this money, salarying himself and his co-president a total amount over $300,000. In these early years, the NDN's primary benefactor was the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which pledged $2.5 million to the NDN, disbursed in installments of $600,000 over several years. Other smaller groups, like the Surna Foundation, a satellite org of the multi-billion-dollar liberal-backed Democracy Alliance, pledged $800,000 to the NDN. In 2019, NDN Collective received a $12 million grant from Jeff Bezos' $10 billion Bezos Earth Fund to support environmental activism. Of this, $9 million was allocated for NDN's self-determination grant program, distributing $100,000 grants to other Native American organizations to defend native lands against the fossil fuel industry. That same year, the NDN Collective also secured significant funding from other foundations: $750,000 from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the charitable organization set up by the Johnson & Johnson family, $550,000 from the Tides Foundation, a San Francisco-based Reynolds Tobacco Fortune charitable project, $400,000 from the Ford Foundation, the same one that funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and $100,000 from the Libra Foundation, set up by the Pritzker family, which made their fortune through the Hyatt hotel chain. NDN founded the Land Back movement just 2 years after their initial founding, drafting what they called the Land Back Manifesto during protests against Donald Trump's campaign in 2020. The document states their objective of reclaiming everything stolen from the original peoples, something that many on the left would consider as the destruction of the capitalist state. But if that's really the case, why is it then that these billionaire-backed foundations give so much money to the organization that many claim to be revolutionary? Indeed, after the announcement of their land back campaign, the Bush Foundation would disperse an additional massive grant of $50 million. Even corporations like Target have given money to the NDN Collective, something that should seemingly be in contradiction to capitalist class interests. What's more interesting, however, is how even the government itself has donated to the NDN Collective, the very institution which Land Back claims to target. In July 2024, a report by Republican staff of the US Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works claimed that left-of-center and far-left groups received funding from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. The report highlighted the NDN Collective as an example, stating that this partner of the Climate Justice Alliance was awarded $100 million in two $50 million grants in federal funding from the US Environmental Protection Agency via the IRA. So now we finally come to the question of why these organizations and even the government itself, founded and controlled by billionaire interests, would be interested in, let alone fund, such a formally anti-government ideology. After all, the NDN's messaging on a surface level is clear. Their objective is to destroy the United States. One needs to simply look into the ideological history of the NDN and its donors. A common trend begins to appear once a proper investigation is done. By and large, the vast majority of funds supplied to the NDN from both private and public institutions has its origins in environmental organizations. But what do environmentalists and land back have in common? Quite a lot. If we study the lessons learned from our investigation of environmentalism itself, the main takeaway is that environmentalism's main goal is to promote the continued financial supremacy of the West over third world countries. The NDN dutifully serves this premise. How exactly? By aligning itself with the so-called Green Agenda, it aims to dismantle Western productive forces while relocating industrial and mineral exploitation to the global South. It has successfully weakened the leverage of Native American working class by promoting a return to pre-industrial land use thereby accelerating deindustrialization. Often, what many NGOs will do is instead of directly taking money from a single backer, they will work so closely with other NGOs that the two groups' membership essentially becomes one and the same. This can be advantageous for multiple reasons. If one NGO wants to indirectly affect a certain policy or movement, they can choose to work with a smaller, more radically aligned NGO to accomplish a number of goals while retaining plausible deniability, softening the bigger organization's image while propping up the smaller one as the main source of radicalism without having to disown them. The NDN is no exception to this practice. Judith LeBlanc, an ex-chairman of the Communist Party USA, helps lead the NDN through her other leadership role with the Native Organizers Alliance, a multi-million-dollar NGO that LeBlanc spearheads. The alliance is heavily funded by the Tides Nexus, a collection of liberal NGOs founded by the heirs of the Reynolds tobacco family fortune, along with the Novo Foundation, founded and led by Warren Buffett's son, Peter Buffett. The Native Organizers Alliance is also part of the Alliance for a Just Society, which is another subsidiary of the previously mentioned Democracy Alliance, whose goal is to orchestrate the construction of a permanent left infrastructure in America under the leadership of the Democratic Party, and all funded by an endless amount of millionaires and billionaires such as George Soros, Peter Lewis, and Tom Steyer. LeBlanc herself has many ties to Democratic Party leadership, as she is on the Council of Alumni Native, a native advocacy NGO owned in part by Arabella Advisors, founded by the alumni of the Clinton administration. The closer one looks at the so-called left-wing organizations in America, the easier it is to see the endless streams of billionaire money and webs of interpersonal, neo-aristocratic leadership that holds it all together.
Arabella Advisors was once called the mothership of a massive progressive dark money group by the Atlantic, and as a Washington consulting firm that has funneled hundreds of millions of dollars through a daisy chain of groups supporting Democrats and progressive causes, and a leading vehicle for dark money on the left by the New York Times. It manages the New Venture Fund and the liberal dark money 1630 Fund, along with other organizations, totaling nearly $10 billion in revenue. The New Venture Fund and the 1630 Fund have several projects they maintain, with a significant portion of their grants directed towards groups like the Campaign for Our Shared Future, founded and led by Eliza Bayard. Bayard was the previous executive director at GLSEN from 2008 to 2021, an LGBT advocacy group promoting LGBT education in K-12 schools, which has cemented itself as one of the most powerful LGBT institutions in the United States. Outside her career at GLSEN, Bayard also worked at the World Bank, the U.S. Department of Education, the National Park Service, UNESCO, and Target. The LGBT movement itself has been funded by very wealthy and powerful benefactors since before it even coalesced into a coherent ideology, despite its organizers' belief in grassroots power. Before the movement's self-proclaimed origin in Stonewall, the visibility of LGBT issues was boosted by the millions of dollars provided to it by the Erickson Education Fund, led by Reed Erickson, a man who was born as a woman but later transitioned. The fund created several organizations that are now well known across the world, including the Johns Hopkins University Gender Identity Clinic, the Harry Benjamin Foundation, and many others. Since then, a multitude of new corporate and billionaire donors have contributed countless millions to fund the operations of LGBT organizations. The Arcus Foundation, founded by billionaire and hired to the multi-billion-dollar Stryker Corporation, John Stryker, has donated over $185 million to various LGBT organizations across the world. The Ford Foundation has donated over $134 million as of 2017. This massive funding has successfully propagated LGBT acceptance in America, but it was not grassroots, as many might claim. From the very beginning, big business and financial interests have pushed dozens of sexual minority advocacy groups to lobby Congress, to protest in the streets, and to bring down politicians. In 2007, U.S. Senator Larry Craig was arrested by the police for lewd conduct in a men's restroom in Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. News of the incident, however, did not break out until 2 months after his arrest. 2 weeks after the arrest, Larry Craig voted no on the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act of 2007, a bill heavily promoted by a variety of NGOs and lobbyists, among them the Ford Foundation. Less than a month later, Larry Craig was headline news in Washington, D.C.'s roll call newspaper for being detained by police due to lewd conduct in an airport bathroom. Craig, though repeatedly stating he was not a homosexual and that he had always been against LGBT reform, was mocked nationwide for his alleged hypocrisy. Later that year, he announced his resignation, and even though it was rescinded, he did not run for election again. Other groups, such as Code Pink, which also has its origins in anti-war protesting, have protested against the treatment of LGBT people in America. Code Pink is primarily funded by Medea Benjamin's Family Trust, created by her father, a rich real estate developer on Long Island. Additional funders include the Soros-linked Tides Foundation and the Global Exchange, which is funded by Rockefeller Charities, the Ford Foundation, and the Open Society Foundation.
The influence of these NGOs has not stopped at simple advocacy groups. Since the end of the Cold War, fully fledged political parties have been funded by billionaire interests, either with the outright infiltration of pre-existing political parties such as the CPUSA, or in the case of the Democratic Socialists of America and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. They have had a direct hand in the creation and establishment of new parties that have taken the spotlight as the torchbearers for their leftist movement. One backed by billionaire NGOs and multinational corporate interests. The aforementioned Max Schachtman had a plethora of contacts and friends who would go on to establish their own political projects. During his time in Schachtman's Independent Socialist League, a certain Michael Harrington grew increasingly upset with the way that Schachtman approached U.S. foreign policy. While Michael Harrington claimed to be against what he called U.S. and Soviet imperialism, Schachtman appeared to be following in his old colleague Burnham's footsteps of neoconservatism, supporting America's war in Vietnam. In the 1972 presidential election, Michael Harrington supported McGovern's campaign, believing that McGovern's victory would open the way for socialist policy to seep into the Democratic Party's ranks, which was part of his so-called realignment strategy, a program that both Harrington and Schachtman agreed upon. However, Schachtman was virulently opposed to McGovern's campaign due to his anti-war stance. Sidney Hook, the man who orchestrated the creation of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, agreed with Schachtman's position. Schachtman's reluctance to endorse McGovern led his Socialist Party's membership to hemorrhage. Harrington would resign his position as chairman of the party in protest. In 1973, Harrington would gather a few hundred of his supporters to a meeting of the future of the Democratic left. By the end of the meeting, only a handful of attendees remained. Those who did resolved to create a new socialist organization, one that would stick to anti-Stalinism while remaining committed to anti-war posturing. this organization will be called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. The long struggle that Harrington imagined would not be one of revolutionary struggle or the building of barricades, but rather one of realigning the Democratic Party. The DSOC's membership, many of whom were students from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, stood at around 500 people. Drawn from this milieu of Trotskyists, liberals, and future neoconservatives, this committee would give birth to the modern-day Democratic Socialists of America. The DSA, as a 501c4 social welfare organization, does not need to publicly disclose its funders. A surface-level glance would reveal that their funding is almost entirely grassroots. But is this the whole story? During the Democratic Party's nomination election of Zohran Mamdani in New York's 2025 mayoral race, the DSA worked with various other groups to raise funds for Mamdani's campaign to defeat Andrew Cuomo. Among these groups were the Working Families Party, a minor progressive party that has had close ties to the now seemingly omnipresent Arabella Advisors. Through the 1630 Fund, the Working Families Party has received tens of thousands of dollars to campaign for Mamdani and other Democratic candidates. However, the story does not stop here. Perhaps the most overlooked ally of the DSA is the broader Democracy Alliance Network, who have provided the majority of funding for most DSA candidates. The DSA themselves do not provide the funding for campaigns. The DSA keeps its hands clean by relying on its membership to turn out for elections and rally in the streets, while groups like the Justice Democrats, whose membership often overlaps with the DSA, provide the necessary funding and infrastructure to elect those candidates. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Cori Bush, among others, are simultaneously part of the DSA while also being in the Justice Democrats. The DSA also works heavily with Democracy Alliance-funded groups like the Center for Popular Democracy, the Economic Policy Institute, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, all three of which have received millions of dollars in funding from George Soros's Open Society Foundation. In 2022, the DSA publicly released records of having received thousands of dollars in funding from groups such as the Schwab Charitable Fund, the Fidelity Charitable Fund, and the American Online Giving Foundation. Despite explicitly saying they do not take corporate donations, dark money networks such as these often give the DSA thousands of dollars to maintain operations. In 2023, the DSA worked with Code Pink and the organization known as the Answer Coalition to hold an anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C. In total, hundreds of people showed up in protest against U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war. But how exactly did these groups fund such an organized demonstration? Answer is a leftist organization founded in the wake of the 9/11 attacks during the United States' invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Despite sometimes working with the DSA, Answer's main allies are found within the Party for Socialism and Liberation, often shortened to PSL. The PSL can trace its origins back to the same Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party which Max Schachmann had broken with. In the late 40s and 50s, a faction within the SWP, led by Sam Marcy, known as the Global Class War Tendency, broke with the party to found a new organization, the Workers' World Party. After both Schachmann and Marcy's exit from the party, the Socialist Workers' Party was left with very little of their original membership. In 2001, the Workers' World Party created Answer as a broad left unity group for demonstrations, and the Progress Unity Fund as a front for funding the party's various activist organizations. When the Party for Socialism broke from the party, both Answer and the Progress Unity Fund continued to finance and share membership with the PSL. One of Answer Coalition's most prominent backers is the Alliance for Global Justice. Though the exact funds the Alliance gave Answer is not publicly available information, the Alliance is noted for having given thousands of dollars to similar organizations over the years, with the revenue totaling more than $2 million. The Alliance itself is funded by a variety of corporate and billionaire donors, including George Soros's Open Society Foundation, the Tides Foundation, Hillary Clinton's New World Foundation, and thousands from various corporate charity foundations. Sharing an office with the Answer Coalition is the Workers' World Party and Party for Socialism and Liberation's fiscal network, the Progress Unity Fund. Though the Progress Unity Fund does not publicly reveal its backers, or even its own leadership, their revenues during 2011 and 2018 varied between $81,000 to $240,000. In 2019, just before Joe Biden's election, the PUF's revenues shot up to a little under $2 million. The two major backers of the party, namely the Open Society Foundation and the aforementioned Democracy Alliance, have spread their influence throughout nearly every leftist party and organization in America. The Democracy Alliance provides the DSA with crucial organizing experience and indirect funding to the Center for Popular Democracy and other related NGOs, while the Open Society Foundation gives the PSL funding through their various financial fronts, like the Answer Coalition and the PUF. A common ideological strand of Trotskyism connects these groups. To varying degrees, all have some connection to the heirs of Trotsky's legacy. As mentioned before, many of these followers of Trotsky, such as James Burnham and Max Schotman, will go on to fulfill a very successful role in shaping U.S. foreign policy, establishing neoconservatism as one of the dominant ideologies in America. Today, the Party for Socialism and Liberation and its cousin, the Democratic Socialists of America, have in effect taken over the Western left. Various European parties, also of Trotskyist origins, have followed suit, towing the line set forth by the NGOs that collaborate with them. The Democracy in Europe movement, co-founded by Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis, is one of the largest leftist movements in the European Union. The DIEM has collaborated frequently with other groups, like Another Europe is Possible, an anti-Brexit advocacy group that is funded by the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, as well as the Best for Britain campaign, which is directly funded by George Soros. Many other European parties follow suit in this regard. In the years since the end of World War II, the West has been overrun by a close-knit group of philanthropists that have managed to dominate almost every sector of public life. Not only has the term grassroots lost nearly all of its meaning, the very idea of genuine left-wing politics, referring to the ideological lineage stemming from the October Revolution, especially within the United States, has disappeared almost completely. The ideals which the modern left holds so dear to their hearts, land back, LGBT, the environment, nearly all of these convictions were not simply co-opted, but have their fundamental roots within the very targets of their supposed political action. These ideals were created and continue to be backed by finance capital. Many leftists will join left-leaning organizations due to the influence of leftist YouTubers, often called breadtubers, who espouse hatred towards the billionaires and wealthy bourgeoisie. But very few of these leftists know that these influencers are funded by these very same billionaire interests. Environmentalists being funded by major tobacco families and oil companies is not simple greenwashing. The practical intent of environmentalism, as proven earlier, is to facilitate a greater degree of control over vital productive land, not just in the global south, but even within America and Europe. Its very origins as a movement arise from the multi-billion-dollar Marshall Plan. To this day, nearly every single modern leftist party has its origins in the Anti-Communist Congress for Cultural Freedom, an organization set up entirely with CIA backing. Most current forms of leftism, from the left communists, to the anarchists, to the Trotskyists, have in some way, shape, or form arisen from this Congress. Even the parties that were steadfast in their support for the Soviet Union, such as the French Communist Party, bled membership during the 1960s as a result of the Congress's pervasive influence on the left, which drew attention away from class issues and towards things like race and gender, suppressing the concrete power that many communist parties had before World War II. The Communist Party of the United States was no exception to this. Herbert Marcuse, a political analyst who cut his teeth working for the CIA's predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, wrote polemics against Soviet communism, eventually forming the basis for critical theory and the so-called New Left. One of his pupils, Angela Davis, would later go on to become extraordinarily influential within the Communist Party USA. Marcuse, who attacked the Marxist focus on labor and rejection of class struggle as a concept, deeply moved Angela Davis, who began shaping CPUSA membership along the lines of the New Left, until her exit from the party to found a Democratic Socialist-aligned organization. It is patently obvious to anyone that the modern left has been maneuvered into a state of de facto anti-communism, one that preserves the superficial veneer of socialism or communism, while remaining tethered to the very corporate and state interests it ostensibly opposes, privately working for them through indirect channels. With the slogans of human rights and democracy, they work hand in hand with the state to bring down foreign governments fighting against imperialism, and collaborate closely with billionaire philanthropists to attack anti-imperialist organizations at home. The more one investigates the left, the more distant from the actual leftist revolutionary tradition that it seems. At present, it is a cesspool of CIA connections, dark money, and corruption that has no end. At the end of this pipeline are the influencers, which have twisted and manipulated the words of famous philosophers to fit their individual agendas. In the war of ideas, both left and right have origins in one single entity: international finance. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to see more from us. If you support our work and want to see the vast archive of sources used in the writing of our Substacks, including some of the sources used in this video, we encourage you to check out our Patreon. Link is in the description below.